I am walking on part of the 20-mile long G&S trail, along which the Groton and Stonington trolleys travelled in the late 1800s until 1928. We have left the towns of Stonington and Mystic and passed through Noank on our way to New London. Both the trolley and railroad systems competed for passengers and followed similar paths from Noank. Both systems built stations, or depots as they were often called. We have already visited the West Mystic Railroad Station, which is by the School Street crossing, and then passed the Noank Station, where they are going in roughly the same direction, but the routes take different paths to get there. The trolley line heads across a trestle towards the entrance to Groton Long Point, where there was a small station. But instead of going into Groton Long Point, the tracks went along Mumford Cove Road. And to a path along Palmer Cove. And from there it took a northwest straight line. The railroad crossed the entrance to Palmer Cove on a bridge. Across a point of land and the causeway towards Haley Farm. The trolley line and railroad lines intersect at a point where the trolley crossed the rails. The bridge still exists as a footbridge. From here we can take one of 3 tracks to New London. Well, first the trolleys. Once over the rail tracks, the trolley path went through a section of Haley Farm and then proceeded along a parallel path with the rail tracks towards the area known as Midway. Midway because it's midway between New York and Boston. It's a highly populated housing area now. Most of the trolley track is fairly curve-free and mostly flat, except for a significant part. There is a steep hill down to the Fort Hill Brook, which is seen here described as a woodland scene. You can just see the man waiting for the oncoming trolley down the steep hill. The brook under the bridge runs down from the side of the water pollution control buildings and flows south towards Mumford Cove, where it enters the cove through a culvert. And it is close to this place that the maps show the eastern end of the huge freight yard complex that we will see soon. But back to the trolley track itself. Once the trolley reached the Midway area, it would have originally gone straight ahead along the path indicated by the overhead power lines, which are dotted here. Then from the Fitch Avenue junction, the trolley went up Depot Road, reaching State Road 1, and turned left. Further along Route 1, it turned left again and went under the early train tracks and along Pequannock Road for a long way towards the edge of the Thames River. Going north along the riverside, it went along Thames Street towards the terminus and ferry landing at School Street. The ferry was available for transportation to New London. So let's go back to the railroad at the point at Haley State Farm, where the railroad and trolley tracks separate. Here is a reminder of where we were. And we see that this area of transportation interest is close to the Bluff Point State Park. Trolleys on the old trolley line, now a trail, left Palmer Cove and crossed the Fort Hill Brook at the top of the green oval. The railroad tracks cross one tip of Mumford Cove where the Fort Hill Brook comes out of the culvert at the bottom of the green oval. The exit place where the rails leave the area is across the Pequannock River. This is a map. It's known as a valuation map of the freight rail system that was created in 1904 in Midway. The location is part of what we know as Bluff Point State Park, and I plan to superimpose this val map on a Google Earth map of Bluff Point to identify and show the precise location of the freight yard tracks, the other buildings and facilities, and its importance at that time. Let's look at the complete val map. At the top right, the east end, is an entry of the rail tracks, and you can see a mass of rails across the area towards the west where they converge and exit the area at the Pequannock River. An alternative set of tracks leads southwest past a roundhouse and turntable. More of that later. The land between these rail sections is a rocky area totally unsuitable for level rails, as we shall see. So let's superimpose the val map onto the Google Earth map. The val map shows every detail of the tracks and buildings in 1915, and you can see how the two fit exactly from Mumford Cove in the east on the right to the West Bridge over the Pequannock River in the top left. Let me expand the val map and then show some pictures of the details of the freight yard. At the ends of the freight yards were what we Brits call signal boxes, or in the US, towers. These were to control the signals and switches that alter the track directions for the trains. Here at the east end is the position of tower number 121. And to put it in its perspective, you can see, looking back, to the bridge that we crossed with the trolleys. The tower is not far from the Mumford Cove culvert. You can see the top of the cove on the left. And this picture indicates the tower's closeness to the cove. Tower 121 was closed in 1927, and maybe these remnants are a sign of the base structure. Here you can see the extent of the tracks and trains at the east end and typical engines that were capable of hauling the long freight trains. As you can imagine, there was a multitude of men working the trains and the yard equipment, and many lived some distance away, for example in New Haven. And so a 36-room nominal cost hotel with dining area opened in 1905. And by 1911 the freight business had grown such that this Midway hotel was increased to 56 rooms. However, it outlived its usefulness as the freight yards declined and closed in 1927. Beyond the hotel to the far left was Midway Station or depot. In between was a building known as the Freight House. Also there's a coal pocket to supply coal quickly to engines on the tracks so that they did not have to travel further into the yard for fuel. The yard had over 20 miles of track, allowing room for up to 70 complete 40-car freight trains. On the east side was a coal elevator, not visible now, except for some stone wall and wooden planking on which the structure would have stood. In the near distance is a water tower and the later coal pocket. In this area, the south side of the yard and south of the raised rock ledge, it is clear that the tracks had to follow the level ground, as side rocks would not have permitted any passage of rails. On the other side of the rocky ledge, further north, are the remains of a large ice house. The stored ice was 9 to 17 inches thick, harvested from ponds in New Haven and New York, and was loaded into eastbound refrigerator cars that were used to preserve and transfer perishable produce. This was a major facility at Midway, where in 1926, for example, between 55 and 60 men in 19 days loaded about 8,000 tons of ice into 30 refrigerated cars per day. The ice house walls and metal stakes to hold the wooden sills are still visible. And also still apparent are the remains of the brick engineering house further up the hill, overseeing the ice house operation down near the rails. However, one of the most interesting parts of the yard is the area of the roundhouse and turntable. And here you can see the building of the turntable and large engine house in the background. There was accommodation for 20 engines in the engine roundhouse and 18 tracks from the turntable to the eastern rails. It was completed in November 1904. The turntable was originally 75 feet in diameter, but by 1917 was increased to 95 feet to permit larger locomotives to be turned. A 1965 aerial view shows the relationship of the roundhouse to the current parking area. It is also visible in a later picture through the surrounding trees. Here is the remaining edge of the pit, which would have held the turntable mechanism. Remnants of the engineering house tracks and wall structures, including metal fasteners, can be found in the brush, as well as odd sections of rail that were discarded when the site was cleared. As Tower number 121 controlled the trains at the east end of the yards, a substantial structure, Control Tower number 120, was situated near the station and hotel at the west and close to the Pequannock River Bridge. We have followed paths that have separated trolley lines from the railroad, and as we leave the Midway yards, we again follow two paths, this time both railroad tracks, both marked New Haven and Hartford, and both heading towards the River Thames. To enable a track to the Thames to be useful from Midway, it would appear that a station or depot dated 1858 with the name Pequannock S for station, was built 3 miles east of New London and, according to a local train timetable, was on the Stonington and Providence Railroad between the Groton and West Mystic depots on the west side of the Pequannock River. It is suggested that its position is indicated in this 1860 map. Unfortunately, this old station burned in December 1900, as reported by the New Haven Register. But to get to this station, the Pequannock River had to be crossed. An alternative Beers map of 1868 recognises the track to Groton Wharf with the crossing of the Pequannock River. To achieve this river crossing, a causeway was constructed in 1858. Its path exists today, with its gap for river water passage, but no bridge. It is seen to have been just wide enough for a single track and remained in use until the 1940s. At this point we need to look at the history of the parcel of land to the west of the river. Morton Plant, a multi-millionaire industrialist, came to Groton and built his summer mansion and estate at Avery Point. In the early 1900s he purchased over 300 acres of the land west of the Pequannock River and established his farm. The railroad ran in a straight line across the fields past Plant's farm. After it was secured as an option for use as a state aviation field, the state bought 275 acres. Here you can see the farm with the railroad running along one side and the grass runways with parked aircraft on the other. At this time the area became known as Trumbull Field, after the state's governor. In the early 1940s, Trumbull Field was expanded to a military facility from Army in 1942 to Navy 1944 and to state control in 1946, with a change from turf runways to concrete. The direct crossing tracks path was subsequently changed from the straight line it had to Baker Cove. The original track is shown in part of the remarkable aerial picture from the Midway Roundhouse to Baker Cove. With the growth of the airport, the subsequent direction for the track was changed to that around the north of the airport. Crossed an at-grade road, then along an elevated causeway to cross the top of Baker Cove and over an elevated bridge. Thomas Avery built a 4-hole golf course in 1898, which eventually became an 18-hole course named Shenecosset Golf Club. And through this area the early train passed on its way across a number of at-grade crossings to the River Thames and the ferry to New London. Let's look at the alternate tracks from the Midway area towards the river. Close to the Midway yards is the community of Pequannock Bridge, where the river is crossed by the road. It is a well-established community in the area, but played no part in the railroad development here. The closest depot is the Midway Station, seen on the right, which was located, it is claimed, where the electrical box is along the main line track by the Amtrak maintenance plant. This route became the de facto main line to the river and its crossing. The current adjacent bridge to the Midway Station at this place carries 3 tracks, 2 electrified lines and a third standard track clearly separated as seen from below. I would surmise that the bricked-up stairs seen through the abutments would once afford access to the 2 sides of the station platforms above. The alternate trackage from Midway to the Thames River was built in 1889. In addition to the 3-track rail bridge from Midway across the Bluff Point access road, a substantial bridge was built across the Pequannock River. Once the new main line was established, all passenger traffic was transferred along that route. At Groton Station, the photograph was dated 1917, was located at the end of Church Street. From the 1915 Val map also indicates the precise position. I believe that this current road corner represents the position of that station. So back to the tracks leaving Midway. They are over the river and across South Road where there are two branch lines into the Tilcon factory premises. Slightly further west is another branch line which forms the track to one arm of a Y. Here it is. The other return track of the Y can be seen shortly. And here it is. Eventually the tracks from the Y enter the Baker Cove area, making a formal crossing at grade and across the golf course, as the previous tracks, towards the Pfizer complex. In the 1920s, the rail hub at Pfizer was already a busy rail and shipping terminal, with extensive rail extensions being added in the 1950s. And alterations to the direct rail-to-ship transfers in the 1960s. By the 1990s, much of the rolling stock bore the company's name, but many of the engines have been transferred for use on other railroads. Despite the location of a Groton Station close to the Thames Bridge in 1917, Amtrak built a Groton Station in Bridge Street. However, Groton was one of the shortest-lived Amtrak passenger rail stations, in service only from January to April 1978. And here is the location. Well, I guess you missed the last train. The story of the rails in the west side of Groton stop at the Thames Bridge. We will continue across the river in part 4 as soon as possible.